Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Ranjit, for doing this conversation on Icelight. Um, I want to start with a few words that I found in your book, and I'm going to read them out, and we're going to talk about them. The title itself, Icelight, and then cloud, storm, wet, tides, boat, anchor, sail, bridge, bay, lighthouse, floating, archipelago, melt, sea, river, rivulet, clouds, monsoon, ship, rain. There's something absolutely moving about Icelight because it takes the motif of water, and we see water in various forms in it. And these were just some of the forms that I picked out over the probably 30-odd poems. So I want to start with asking you the question about how water ties this poetry collection together. And I think especially since we are doing this by the beach, it's the right venue and the right time.
Thank you so much for this, Nandini. In the first place, I'm really happy we're in conversation here as we have often been in private. And thank you also for identifying those motifs of water, because Icelight to me is the third in a set of three collections of poetry. It's a trilogy. The first of which is Jonah Whale, and the second is Hunch Prose, and this one. And in all of them, I've been preoccupied with the questions of what might history mean when seen from the sea rather than from land? And I think for all kinds of reasons, both personal and political, I think that switch has been crucial to me. Because I think when we invest ourselves in land-based histories, those histories tend to emphasize invasion, territoriality. Not that that doesn't exist in maritime histories, but when you're in a city like this, for instance, I was just struck wandering about yesterday and today by the layers and layers of history here. Languages, ethnicities, residues of migrations. I think the sea's always been more open to the possibility of encounter, of what you might want to call xenophilia. This is a term, a concept that I'm very attached to. I think because the normal tendency seems to be xenophobic. You want to resist the other. But to me, water, the possibilities of the estuary, the delta, the ocean currents, all of this speaks of ways in which you can really reinvent yourself, speak new languages, just become someone else and embrace the risk of difference. So that has been a thread for me, both in the poetry and in other things I write.
I think since we're sitting in Kerala, maybe you can just elaborate a little bit about that, because it's such a beautiful way to imagine seeing history from the point of view of the sea. So again, maybe in the context of a coastal state, what does that mean? And also, I know you are very partial to the sea. You're an avid swimmer yourself. Oh, no. You've often mentioned that.
Yeah, I've always responded very much to the sea. Also, although I was born in Bombay, I spent the first formative years of my childhood in Goa in the 70s, when it was still... I'm going to irritate people by calling it the annexation. Indians like to call it the liberation. But it was about 10 years after the Portuguese had been sent off. So it was still very, very Indo-Iberian. There was a tremendous awareness of a different route to the modern than what had prevailed in the British Raj. It was a Lusophone, a Konkani kind of modernity. And there was really a great awareness of the kinds of connections that we've lost by locking ourselves into nation states. So when I'm here, for instance, I'm very, very struck by 2,000 years of belonging to an Indian Ocean zone, which connects the west coast here to the Arab lands, to Persia, to the East African seaboard. So I think there's a case to be made for retrieving this way of being in the world. So I'm wandering totally off topic now, but another of my key preoccupations. I think we actually staked something on that as a new nation state through the non-aligned movement. And this notion of an Afro-Asian unity, seeing the world from the global south, a lot of that has to do with an awareness of maritime comings and goings.
But how can poetry respond to this idea of us being locked in a nation state? Because it's a very political concept, and as a poet, how do you feel you can respond?
Poetry is political. And I think for me that takes the form sometimes of retrieving figures like Siddhi Mubarak Bombay, who was an enslaved person in Bombay in the 19th century. It sometimes means recovering languages like Lashkari. One of the, again, most people are startled when, as a poet, you say, I've done some research on this poem. I have a very, very dear friend, a German novelist, Ilya Troyanov. When I said to him once that I was researching a poem, he sort of fell about and laughed and said, that is what we do, the novelists, the non-fiction guys. So I said, no, maybe it ends up as 2 pages in a book, but there is a certain amount of labor in the archive to be done. And I think when I was working in a previous book, it was an amazing experience to look at Amitav Ghosh's glossary of Lashkari, the language of the mariners. And formally, for me, it's a way of opening up the language I write in. You know, I mean, I'm an Anglophone poet, but I'm a multilingual reader. And to me, it's of great interest to see how I can open up the body of my text to these other languages that I read and other sounds that come to me, for one. And I think that might be one way of questioning dogmas that want to tie us narrowly to one kind of linguistic or regional or national identity or ethnic identity.
Talking about lost languages, you have this beautiful poem, and it's about the language of ghosts. I think maybe you can tell the audience about that, because it's a very special poem and it ties into your interest in translation, because you've, of course, translated the Kashmiri poet Lal Ded.
It actually comes, that is actually for me a very political poem, because many of the poems in Icelight and in Hunch Prose, the book previous, were written in the context of Kashmir, which, as an ancestral homeland for me, I've had a very, very strong sense of not only its antiquity, but also of its very turbulent and troubled and militarized present. So that poem that you referred to picks up on the idea that Kashmiri descends from an earlier language called Peshachi. Linguistically, this is not true. But it was convenient to me to think about what does it mean to think about a language of ghosts? And what does it mean for people to be reduced to ghosts in their own country, prevented from utterance, surveilled, forced into darkness? What kinds of responses does that breed, and how do these ghosts get stigmatized? So for me, it was a way of reaching back into a literary past to find tropes to address the present.
Of course, you mentioned that you write in English, you're a poet in English, but you translate from various other languages, Urdu, Kashmiri. How do these speak to each other? How do these different interests sort of tie in? How do they nurture each other?
For me, I grew up in a multilingual family for all kinds of reasons. There are multiple ethnicities and languages represented there. So I cannot remember a time when I wasn't translating one way or another. Also, parents and grandparents grew up in different parts of the country.
What were the languages you grew up with?
Konkani, English, Hindustani, Dakhani, because one branch of the family is in Hyderabad. Also, overhearing Kannada, which my parents knew and held to themselves as a code, but they'd grown up in those parts of the subcontinent. So I was always in a state of great curiosity, and Kashmiri remembered as the language of the past, which I then put myself through an apprenticeship to. Learned Sanskrit and held on to that, and so on and so forth. But for me, language has never been an instrument. To me, there's a kind of a sacramental sense of language being a threshold that opens up dimensions of the world to you. So as a poet also, I was really profoundly inspired by amazing figures in the generation previous to ours. A.K. Ramanujan, Agha Shahid Ali, particularly, I would think of. It was the model or the exemplar of how to be a poet that figures like Raman and Shahid gave us, I think. It showed that translation was not something that you did on the side or in spare time, but that it was actually central to what it means to be a poet in or related to South Asia.
What are the different joys and challenges of when you're writing your own poetry as compared to when you're translating a poem?
I think there's, in the best sense, there's a certain degree of irresponsibility when you're working on your own poetry, by which I mean really that your latitude to be experimental is a little more. When I'm translating, I'm always aware of deep responsibility to the poet, to the text, and to the context from which the poetry emerges. So, in a sense, it's not different. Poetry and translation are both ways in which you bear witness to something larger than yourself. But when you're translating, for instance, with the Mir Taki Mir, I was very, very aware that I'm thinking about a poet whose life resonates for us because he too lived in a time of great political meltdown in a city that was invaded repeatedly, someone who spent part of his life in exile, first in the Jat strongholds and then in Lucknow. So there's, translation for me is a way of expanding my own poetic repertoire, but also it is in a spirit of homage to whoever I'm translating.
So you, of course, have poetry and translation as one of the two hats you wear, and then there's art, right? There's art criticism and there's art essay writing. You've just brought out a book on essays on Geev Patel, and I think in this book as well, you have a poem to the artist Zarina Hashmi, and I think even in the notes you talk about the various ways in which art has sort of colored your poets. Let's talk about that connection, about just the visual arts and how they are so intrinsic to it.
Actually, unlike most people in their generation, my parents really thought I should have gone to art school. And they were very dismayed when I decided to spend 2 years doing science, which was a mistake, admittedly, and then I remedied that. But originally, my interest was also very, very strongly in the visual arts. And that continued, but because I began to write about it and then curate, it's no longer a thing I really practice. But to me, again, the visual arts are a challenge and a stimulation in the most productive sense, because visuality challenges interpretation. It resists language, even when it uses language. I mean, we know there's a linguistic turn in the visual arts where language is used as a visual material, but even so, there's a way in which painters or sculptors push you away when you try and bring language to the encounter. So that's a space I've always been excited by. So although you're pushed away, you want to come back and render homage.
I want to go to a particular poem because I think it kind of ties into you talking about what language can do and what language cannot do. It's on page 29 and it's called Postscript.
Okay, this is a poem called Postscript. And in one of those acts of caprice that go into making a book, I thought it might be amusing to put it somewhere in the middle instead of at the end. Postscript. It goes like this. What if one day you scanned the sky and found no trace of terns that homing crest the tide, no arc of gulls gliding towards mirage shoals, their journeys stalled, the winds too strong, or their wings not strong enough? What if the earth slowed down, pulled off its gloves, and raised its knuckles to the late spring? Would you defy the whiplash fates and craft subtle compensations for the baffled will? Would you try for balance as you climbed the broken slopes of cloud, and shaking between whisper and shout, would you voice the poet's oldest fear? What if one day the words refuse to come?
Is that your biggest fear? Words refusing to come?
I have to say it's one of my great fears, yeah.
And why might that happen? When might that happen?
I think it was our Parthasarathi who spoke of how all poets eventually work themselves to a state of aphasia, but Partha tended to be a little bleak in his prognostications. But I think that is a fear for most writers, and since we're at a literature festival, it's wise to think of the fears and anxieties and traumas as well. I think that's really your primary way of forming a connection or a bridge to the world, and if language is taken away, what then might happen? I mean, this might well happen for neurological and other sadly unavoidable reasons that await. But it could also and does in fact happen when language is forbidden, or certain turns of phrase are forbidden or are stigmatized. So for me, this works across the spectrum. The words might refuse to come, also because you're not pushing hard enough, that calls for effort, but the words may be prevented from coming as well.
You mentioned earlier that, of course, poetry is political, and this book is political as well, right? So you have these absolutely stunning images of the natural world, but it is also talking about we're at the cusp of something, and we're at the cusp of something that is dangerous, that's frightening. So can we talk a little bit about both those, about how beauty lies in poetry, but also it's talking about these very brutal realities that we are now living?
I don't think we can really think about nature in the way in which poets could do that 300 or 400 years ago. And even then it was under threat. But what you see today is clearly a natural world which bears our impress. I mean, whatever you might want to call it, the Anthropocene or the capitalist scene, it's very, very clear today that nature is not only not a counterpoint to the social and the political, it's actually, in some ways, I'm going to use the word advisedly, infected by these. So that is the nature to which we have to bear witness, which also means a measure of responsibility. It's, even if I use, say, to offer a really banal example, I might use animal imagery, but I'm always very, very aware that these are endangered forms I'm thinking about, and they're endangered by our needs as a species. So in writing about nature, I can never forget that we're now looking at nature from a perspective of species sovereignty, which has gone so terribly wrong. And yet we have political leaders who encourage people to drill away, as we heard 2 or 3 days ago.
Drill, baby, drill.
Drill, baby, drill, indeed, yeah, and so on. I cannot believe that it isn't absolutely clear to everyone that this extractivism has destroyed the planet and will take us with. That wave of extinction will take us with it. So in many, many ways, this book is elegiac in its tonality for this reason too.
I want to ask you, how do you write poetry, right? Because we were standing here and you were looking around and you were like, oh, this is such a melancholic tent, right? So is poetry, are you writing it all the time in your head, or are you actually sitting down at your computer and then the images and metaphors come?
I love it when writers say, I need to have a wonderful bay window, and here's my desk, and this is my little talisman. Fantastic. But I find that usually it's, I would treasure those moments as well. But I think over the years, just because I've been involved in so many other things, and also for my sins, I have to travel, I've kind of adapted to thinking in terms of constantly making notes or fragments, or putting down fragments and then working with them. So in a way, there is a musicality of surprise that keeps going constantly. Yeah, but in this, again, I'm speaking now really of the Anglophone tradition in a certain way, but these were the people who I felt very, very close to. I've thought back often to the practice of Keki Daruwala, who we lost very recently, unfortunately. And this was a person who was involved in matters of state, of high policy and security questions. And yet the counterpoint was this poetry which went on constantly, where it was like it was a twin who looked upon the political, the state, history, archaeology from this somewhat distant but very empathetic perspective. So again, that's the kind of sensibility that I would admire. Someone who's able to be fully engaged in the demands and responsibilities of worldly life, but retains the sense of sanctuary in which to write.
You've been in Kerala, I think, for maybe 24 hours, and today you said you were wandering around the city. Has there been a special moment or something that's caught your interest and which might find its way into a poem? I'm just curious.
I'm going to say too early to say, but I did really want to see this wonderful mosque not too far away from here, because it reminds us of, the architecture, for instance, it takes us back to a time of confluence, which is one of my theoretical preoccupations, as you know. Again, it comes out of that Indian Ocean world. So you have the Zamarin here, you have these profound connections across the water with Arabia and with East Africa. And you have also the moment of rupture when Portuguese colonialism arrives and wants to break those mercantile and cultural connections. and opens up a whole new era premised on violence and on xenophobia, actually. So I have a sense that visiting this, from my point of view, shrine to a certain kind of confluential history might result in something, but it may well be a prose text as well.
Uh, maybe that brings me to my next question. You've done essays, you've done poetry. Is there a novel lurking somewhere?
Alas, no. I wish there was. There are times when more narrative poems tend to veer towards fiction, and then I somehow remain wedded to the idea of opening up the text of the poem, the body of the poem, to polyphony, to multiple voices, to different registers. I have not embarked on a long fiction text yet. Remember, I'm going to call it a long fiction text so as not to jinx the novel that might come.
I want to just ask you about the last line in the book, which is a very beautiful line. I think you should read it out. Yeah.
The last line.
Or maybe the last three lines.
The last,
Oh,
no,
the last line.
the last line. Light returns to the world.
And there's no full stop. I want to end on a slightly optimistic note, but can you tell us about the significance of that?
I'll actually take the formal or technical question first, the punctuation. Over these last three collections, I've more or less, to the dismay of my editors, I've kind of dispensed with punctuation, more or less. There's just the question mark usually that appears. And that came out actually of a long apprenticeship to Urdu poetry, where, of course, as you know, there's no capitalization and there's no punctuation. And there's also an incredibly diaphanous syntax. So for me, it was a way of thinking about opening up the English sentence. How might one do that? How might a sentence point in multiple ways at the same time? What does one, can one work with the arrangement of the poem on the page? So to me, that in itself is a kind of a formal token of liberation of some kind. But considering that this book is shadowed and has the shadows of loss, and it was also written, a large part of it comes out of remembering my father, really, who passed while it was in process. So it's just a sense that however much one might, even if one is sitting in this relatively melancholic tent, the fact that we're all gathered here together and have brought our linguistic, our literary, our cultural energies to this occasion, to me that itself is a manifestation of light. So I think we can never really give up hope. And I'm very struck when I speak sometimes to much younger people, or younger people, I'm old, so I should just say younger people, and or my students at Ashoka, the sense that the world is closing in on them with dire import is so strong. And I keep thinking we cannot give up on hope. We cannot give up on the fact that there is, in fact, a horizon. Or else we would just simply be committing ourselves to servitude without resistance.
That's beautiful. Servitude without resistance. We have 2 minutes for questions. This was a very short session, so I'm sorry we couldn't have any time more, but are there any questions?
How do you prepare to teach writing?
How do I prepare to teach writing? I don't think anyone can teach writing. This is what I tell my students, that the best I can do is to offer them models of creative reading. And I think that's the only way one can do it. I don't think anyone can give you a formula, although the entire MFA system, as we well know, is based on that premise. But it's only by opening people up to experimental forms of reading, when you take yourself out of your comfort zone as a reader, I think that's really the basis from which you launch yourself off and begin to savor forms of writing. Yeah? And you have to be very strict with yourself. There's really no room for indulgence. There is a side of writing, as we know, which is, for lack of another description, very military and athletic. And there's no way to get away from that.
Any more questions? Anybody? Okay. Then I will ask you one more question, since you mentioned that this book is dedicated to your father, and you have a very beautiful tribute, which maybe I'll just read out. It says, "In memory of Raghuveer Narayan Hoskote, my father, my first guide into the labyrinth. Where are you in the labyrinth right now?
As one always is in the labyrinth, you look around and say, I wish I knew. But I think that's the challenge of the labyrinth. I think it's you might feel completely lost and hopeless in it, but I think there's also a spatial challenge to the labyrinth that keeps you going. So even if you don't know quite where you're going, it's, to me at least, it's the things you do along the way and what you learn about yourself and others.
And has writing provided a way out of the labyrinth?
I would say a way through the labyrinth.
And like art as well, or what are your sort of guides through the labyrinth?
I have to say creativity in its expanded sense. So writing as a primary means for me, but also the way in which I would respond to the work of other artists. Whether also music, music, for instance, has always been a deeply, deeply nourishing source of inspiration for me. So also a part of this labyrinth of the creative imagination.
What was some of the music you were listening to while writing this?
A whole body of 20th century music that for some reason that I can't fathom is called minimalist. But some of my favorite musicians, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, Brian Eno. I think I was listening to some of Steve Reich, Music for 18 Musicians on loop. But also Kumarji's Nirguni Bhajans. I mean, that plangent voice of a musician creating a new form of music based on just the one lung he had left. It's unbelievable. I mean, it's still, I get goosebumps just thinking of the Nirguni Kabir Bhajans that Kumar Gandharv sang. And that music was with me quite often while I was writing. Not literally while I was writing, but it was playing on loop in my mind.
Thank you so much, Ranjit. Thank you for the audience. Thank you to KLF. I would recommend you buy Icelight. It's like a prism. It shatters light, it brings light together, but at the end there is a rainbow. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nandini, and thank you all for being here.